I've done a documentary called Uncle Tom 2, a sequel to my first documentary called Uncle Tom, in which we talk about the black experience after slavery. After slavery, most blacks were illiterate. Within a few decades, most blacks could read and write. And in 1940, 87% of blacks lived under the poverty line. 20 years later, 1960, that number had fallen to 47%, a 40-point drop in 20 years. That is the greatest 20-year economic expansion of blacks in the history of this country. Think about it. 87% below the poverty line in 1940, 20 years later, 40%, 47%, 40-point drop. Why? There was a Klan, there were lynchings, there were cross burnings, there was Jim Crow. Basically 4 reasons. Reason number 1, the family. It was rare for a black kid to be born without a father married to the mother. Extremely unusual. In fact, there's lots of evidence that suggests in certain cities, certain areas, a black kid was slightly more likely to be married to a mom, to enter the world with a mom and dad married to each other than a white kid. 20 years later, 1960, again, that number had fallen to 47 points. Now, this is before the Civil Rights Act of 1964, before the Voting Rights Act of 1965, before the Open Housing Act of 1968, pretty much. That was just 8 years later. Brown v. Boer didn't happen until 1954. And Jim Crow was still going on. Family. Also, a belief in the ideals of America. Now, that may sound heretical these days. A bunch of people running around talking about how racist America is, that America broke the contract, yada blah, etc. We'll get to that in a second. If you read the writings of people like Frederick Douglass, they are replete with references to the Constitution, to the American ideals, to American virtues, American values, even though, of course, those values were not being adhered to. And this is a man, Frederick Douglass, who was born a slave. He escaped from his plantation, escaped to Massachusetts, and was shocked at meeting blacks who were more prosperous than some of the most prosperous whites in the South. In fact, he wrote that he assumed that a culture, a country could not become wealthy without slaves. He was shocked. Belief in God, belief in Judeo-Christian values, a belief that God does not want to give you a burden that you cannot handle. So family, American values, God, and entrepreneurship. Booker T. Washington, also a slave, wrote a book called Up From Slavery, came out in 1901. Now think about this. He said in that book, and I'm paraphrasing, when a Negro boy learns to cook, to sew, to wash dishes, to practice medicine as well as or better than somebody else, he or she will be rewarded without regard to race. The world wants the best. That is a great, he said, human law. 1901, that's just 36 years after slavery. And he sounds more optimistic about America than these Black Lives Matter people, which I'll get to in just a second. Now, there was a rapper, I hadn't heard of him until yesterday. He was murdered at a restaurant, popular restaurant chain called Roscoe's Waffle and Chicken House. I think there are 3 of them in LA. One is in Hollywood, one is in an area called Pico, and one is in Manchester, an area not too far from where I grew up. He was murdered in the Manchester one. Here's a news clip.
Shock and anger from fans of rapper PnB Rock, who was shot and killed yesterday. It happened during a robbery, and the killer is still on the loose. CBS 2's Tina Patel, she's live with an update on this investigation. You know, Tina, do we have any idea of who this suspect may be?
Notice he said the killer is still on the loose. There were lots of people there witnessing it, and nobody said that the perp was a white supremacist.
Unfortunately, we don't, Chris, and that's what makes it so hard for everyone involved. You know, the restaurant is actually back open this morning. We just talked to a company spokesperson who says that they wanted to make sure that they didn't let fear get the best of them, but they say they are all here with a heavy heart, especially when they look out in the parking lot and see the growing memorial here. Marcus Rogers was taking his sons to school when they decided to stop at the memorial for rapper PnB Rock.
It's just sad because he was up and coming. You know, he was on his way.
He was up and coming. He was on his way. PnB Rock was a rapper. He was from Philadelphia. Came out to L.A. And a man, apparently demanding property, he had jewelry on, PnB Rock did, shot him and took his jewelry. Now, he was born Rakeem Hasheen Allen, 30 years old, rose to fame with a song called Fleek, F-L-E-E-K. In 2016, had a hit song called Selfish, and collaborated with another rapper for a single called Every Day We Lit. Here's a little bit of Every Day We Lit, or at least a video of it. And the term lit means every day we get high off of booze or off of some sort of drug. Every day we lit. Now, this is the second major rapper killed in South Central Los Angeles in recent times. The other one was named Nipsey Hussle, very respected, also murdered. Now, I grew up in the 50s and the 60s, and my music was Motown music. Supremes, Temptations, Martha Reeves and the Vandellas. I like Atlantic Stax music too, Otis Redding, Aretha Franklin. People didn't do drive-bys on each other. They didn't do hits on each other. They didn't bless each other out in music. What's happened to the quote unquote black culture? And I'm looking at PnB Rock's background. According to Wikipedia, born in the Germantown neighborhood of Philadelphia, his father was murdered when he was 3 years old, raised by his mom. Not uncommon now today for a black kid to be raised by the mom. 70% of black kids today enter the world without a father married to the mother, and something like 85% of these kids at some point will be living in a household without a father. And again, don't get mad at elder. Barack Obama. A kid raised without a father is 5 times more likely to be poor and commit crime, 9 times more likely to drop out of school, 20 times more likely to end up in jail. A direct relationship between not having a father in the home and all of these social ills that you see. One of my friends is the great Thomas Sowell, the economist. He's written something like 40 books and came from the South, but he was raised by family members. His parents died when he was very young. Family members in East Harlem. And he tells me on hot summer days in the 1940s when he grew up, people would sleep outside. No air conditioning. It wasn't uncommon for people to sleep on park benches in parks. It was so hot. They would sleep on top of their cars. It was so hot. Nobody feared being robbed. Nobody feared being mugged. Nobody feared their neighbors. Nobody feared kids, teenagers. Today, that would be unthinkable for somebody to lay out in the middle of the street, on a park bench, on a lawn, wearing a watch, having a wallet. Nobody would think about doing that now. What's happened to our culture?